Hi, guys, and welcome to our next lesson. So, we're actually going to be starting a new unit. And before we really start talking about, the growth of the United States on the world stage and how the U.S. becomes a global power, we're going to talk a little bit about this age of empire. I'm going to give a broad overview of this, and we are going to talk a little bit about the progressives and the progressive era because that really is. Intertwined with this age of empire. They were taking place around the same years in the same period of time. So today's going to be kind of an introduction to what we're going to be talking about more in depth over the next couple weeks. So that's what this lesson is going to be really about. So the objective of this lesson is by the end you should be able to explain why some Americans during this time supported imperialism while others opposed it, right? And just an overview. So in the late 19th century, the United States actually abandoned its century-long commitment to isolationism and became an imperial power. That's like the first major point. And I'll go more in depth on this, but that's something I want you to leave this lesson with. One of the most important points from this lesson. The other thing is, after the Spanish American War, the United States exercised a lot of influence and control over Cuba. We annexed Hawaii, claimed Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines as our territories. And the other thing is, there was both a desire for new markets for industrial products, manufactured goods, and this belief in the racial and cultural superiority of Americans. And those two things together really motivated the United States and its imperial mission during this period. So let's talk a little bit about the end of isolationism. So the United States had once been a colony, right? We learned this at the beginning of the year. And because it was a colony, its fate and its fortunes were tied inextricably with those of Great Britain. Remember, Great Britain was the mother country. And the United States, found its colonial status to be at odds with its belief in representative government. And in the late 18th century, a new alliance with France helped the United States, throw off colonial rule. Remember, uh, but the help of those European powers like France, they always came with strings attached and entanglements, as we'd call them, that the American government found to be dangerous as it struggled to grow and thrive early on. And, George Washington, after he'd seen the effect of foreign alliances on his administration, he left office as president and he, stepped down and he had served his terms and he was done being president. And when he left office, he warned his successors, future presidents, and really all Americans to avoid becoming entangled in foreign alliances. And he said this in his farewell address of 1796. And for 100 years, with very few exceptions, uh, future presidents obeyed this. And, with an ocean that separating the United States from Europe, the United States was able to develop into a vast and productive country, while wars and famines and revolutions elsewhere in the world caused a lot of immigrants to come here, as we learned about in our previous unit. And so, the United States really took George Washington's advice to heart and pursued a policy known as isolationism, which is the idea of avoiding alliances and international affairs as best it could. That's really what the United States decided to do. And for the United States, the policy of isolationism primarily meant staying out of military alliances that might, accidentally draw the United States into a war. The United States had no desire to find itself in a war against England, due to an alliance with France, for example, right? They didn't want to go to war with England. They didn't want to go to war with anybody. And, another important point to make is American isolationism was not a policy of economic or cultural isolationism. The United States, they we did seek out trading partners and markets to sell goods and to trade with other countries, and we also didn't seek to, systematically purge any foreign influences from our culture. Even though many nativists, as we learned in the previous unit, they did um, dislike aspects of culture that was imported by immigrants, but really the United States was a quote unquote melting pot. And so while Americans were isolationists in terms of military alliances, they weren't necessarily isolationists in terms of economics and culture. But in the late 19th century, so right at the turn of the century, in the space of just a few years from 1898 to 1901, the United States went from being a former outpost of the British Empire, right, a former colony, to an imperial power in its own right, and ended up claiming territory or influence over no fewer than 5 islands outside its territorial boundaries, including Cuba, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So, why in such a short time did the United States abandon its policy of isolationism and take on colonies of its own? That's a logical question to ask yourself. And here is just a picture that kind of symbolizes isolationism very, very clearly. You can see on this sign it says no foreign entanglements, right? That's the definition of isolationism. The United States government did not want to get involved in any type of military alliances or wars. They didn't want to be dragged into any wars. And obviously, we're going to talk about, why did it change? Why did it go from this policy to the United States actually taking on colonies of its own? And so let's talk about the scramble for colonies during this period. So, one explanation for the United States' entry into imperialism was peer pressure. So, between 1870 and 1900, the industrial nations of Europe and Asia, particularly Great Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, they all fought and scrambled to seize territory in the undeveloped world. And these powers were able to divide Africa and Asia among themselves because the people of Africa and Asia did not have the firepower and technology to fight back. And many people in the United States during this time feared that if America didn't join the race for empire, that the great powers of Europe and Asia would leave the United States behind. And so here you can see there's a map of the empires in 1900, and look at the large number of empires which were trying to take control of Africa during this period. You can see there are many nations who were scrambling in Africa to try to conquer and take over as much land as possible. And unfortunately, a lot of the Africans were unable to fight back because they simply didn't have the technology or firepower to do so. So, what was the point of having colonies in the first place? Why did Europe and Asian countries and why did the United States want colonies? So, like the system of mercantilism, which we talked about in our first unit, under which, mercantilism was the system under which the American colonies had sent raw materials to Great Britain and purchased finished goods in return, right? So it was this relationship between Great Britain and America that really was meant to benefit the mother country. And colonialism was a similar system, and it was designed to benefit the imperial power, usually at the expense of the colony. So colonies were territories that were conquered by an imperial power, and colonies provided sources of valuable raw materials like diamonds, gold, timber, oil, rubber, and many, many others. And, the colonies provided those materials to for the imperial power. And their populations, the populations of these territories, these colonies, served as markets for the industrial products made in the home country. So, if, for example, England would make textiles, they'd make clothing, right? And manufacture other products, and they would sell those products to the people living in the colonies, right? So they would harvest and take all the raw materials from the colony, like cotton, maybe, for example, uh, turn that into a manufactured product, and then sell that product back to the people living in the colony. So really, it was all about making money for the home country. And markets were particularly important for the United States. The United States had emerged as the world's leading industrial power uh, during and after the Gilded Age. And capitalism as a system could only really thrive and grow and expand as long as people purchased the products of industry. And at the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s, Americans were beginning to fear that new markets within the United States were drying up now that manifest destiny had been achieved. And manifest destiny was this belief that God intended the United States to occupy the North American continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, right? And so in 1893, eminent historian Frederick Jackson Turner, he declared that the American frontier was now closed. And this led to many people, many Americans, to fear that the pioneering spirit, which they felt was central to American identity, was threatened and was in jeopardy. And besides that, it also meant that, maybe there isn't uh, as many markets available for us now that manifest destiny has been achieved. Maybe there's not as many new markets for the United States to sell goods to, right? It was a changing time. It was a time when they started to question what American identity really was now that they'd finally achieved manifest destiny. So, what would Americans do now that their expansion just wasn't possible anymore? They had already reached the ends of the continent. Who would Americans be if they no longer had any wilderness to conquer? And so here is an image that kind of, symbolizes manifest destiny. I'm sure you had to have seen this drawing or painting in your 8th grade class. And this just represents this, again, this idea of manifest destiny, this idea that God intended, he wanted the United States to conquer and occupy North America from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, right? And with this happening, there was like an identity crisis in the United States among many Americans. So these questions were really still unanswered when uh, some events started to unfold. There was some disturbing news, and we'll talk much more about this in depth, but there was some disturbing news that came from Cuba. Right, and Cuba is this island right off the coast of Florida in the Gulf of Mexico. And in Cuba, there were guerrilla rebels who were attempting to overthrow the Spanish. And after an American warship exploded in the harbor at Havana. Havana is the capital of Cuba, and an American warship was in the harbor there, and it had exploded. And the United States declared war on Spain after this, and Spain was greatly outmatched. And within about 6 weeks, the United States had defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. And in the process, the United States acquired significant influence over Cuba and claimed Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as territories. And also, the United States ended up annexing Hawaii. And not everyone was happy about this, happy about the United States' new role as an imperial power. There was this irony that a former colony, which had once rebelled against a distant government across the ocean, this former colony was now governing distant peoples. And this irony was not lost on many people who were, alive during this period. And others protested that imperialism would include people of inferior races in the United States. And this group called the Anti-Imperialist League, which included some people like Andrew Carnegie and Samuel Gompers, remember the labor leader from the previous unit. Those two men, as well as many others, were part of this Anti-Imperialist League, and they protested the United States' new empire. And some of the people who opposed this empire, they didn't do so in terms of caring about the people that were being conquered. It was more they were afraid that the inferior races might damage or poison American culture and the United States if they were allowed to be included in the United States. So it wasn't completely a, a, like a genuine care for the people who were being conquered. And here is a painting, and actually it's of Teddy Roosevelt, who is a former American president. And we will definitely talk much more about him, his role in the Spanish American War, and his role as president, right? He's actually a famous progressive, and he helped to lead American soldiers in the Spanish American War in this group called the Rough Riders. And like I said, we'll talk much more about that. But this is basically a painting showing the Rough Riders in the Spanish American War as the United States fought against Spain and tried to help and ultimately gain control of Cuba. And here is an illustration on the cover. It's from the cover of Puck magazine, as you can see, from 1901. And it shows Columbia. And Columbia is this symbolic representation of the United States. Columbia is this woman here. And in imagery like this, it tends to serve as a representation of the United States. And you can see Columbia is trying on a new hat, and the hat says world power on it. And it kind of just shows the United States growing into a world power during this period. So many others saw these territories, these new territories that the United States was claiming and obtaining, as signs that the United States had come of age. And many Americans saw it as their duty to spread the light of civilization and democracy to the backward people of the world. Many Americans were convinced of the superiority of people of Anglo-Saxon descent, right? They thought that people who were Anglo-Saxon were superior to all other peoples. And they were so convinced of this that these Americans saw it as the white man's burden to basically govern and somehow uplift the people of Latin America and the Pacific, whether they really wanted it or not. And this phrase, white man's burden, it's taken from a poem by the author and imperialist booster Rudyard Kipling. And so, yeah, there was conflicting ideas of whether or not the United States' new role as an imperial power was a good thing or a bad thing. Clearly, you have some who saw it as a good thing, that it was the United States' role to bring democracy and to bring civilization to these quote unquote backward people. And then there were others who thought that this was dangerous. This was actually harmful to the United States. And in addition to obviously being harmful to some of those who were being conquered and having their territories annexed and taken over. So I kind of want to show this cartoon next, and it's a cartoon illustrating this white man's burden, right? This idea that you can see here, Uncle Sam, he's standing on these different rocks, these stones. One says barbarism and oppression and ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition, right? And that the United States is somehow carrying these different minority groups, right? You have Cuba As you can see here, China, and the United States views it as its role to care for these people and to bring them to civilization. You can see civilization in the top left corner of this image. And the United States, oh, you can also see on Uncle Sam's arm there the Red Cross, right? And typically that represents someone who is there to help, right? Like a nurse or, the Red Cross today, a group that will help people in disaster zones and bring them food and aid and supplies. And so you can see that image being used here as well. And this is very emblematic. It's a symbolic of this idea that somehow it was the responsibility of white Anglo-Saxon people to civilize, quote unquote, civilize these backward people. It's a very interesting photo, very obviously not politically correct today, right? So I want to know what you think. What Why do you think some Americans supported imperialism and why did some oppose it? And again, this was the learning objective, so you should be able to answer this. And I want you to be able to explain your answer, use complete sentences, and really, explain yourself. Use some evidence from this lesson in order to support your answer. Why did they support it, some of them, and why did some of them oppose it? And so let me know if you have any questions at all about this, and then I'll see you guys in the next lesson.